Before you start to learn how to locate decimals on a number line, you need to understand how to create a number line. So I'm going to start by drawing myself a number line with arrows on both ends, and I'm going to start by labeling it at 0. Then I want to create a number line that matches my decimal place values. So I'm either going to create a decimal line with 10 spaces, because I know I have a place value labeled tenths, or I could use 100 spaces to label my hundredths, or I could make 1,000 spaces to represent thousandths. The basic number line is going to use 10 spaces. So I'm going to count 10 equal spaces, or try to make them equal. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The 10th space, or 10th tick mark, I know that once I get 10 tenths, I have one whole. So I can check to make sure that I have 10 spaces. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So because I have 10 spaces, each of these spaces represents one space out of 10. I can write that as a fraction, but I also know that that can be said as a decimal that represents 1/10. So if I wanted to figure out what this green point was labeled, I would start by 0 and I would count over how many spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It is over 5 spaces out of 10, so as a decimal that would be 5 tenths. I can try another one. I can start back at 0. I already know this is 5 tenths. 6, 7, 8, 9. This is 9 out of 10 spaces, and as a decimal I would label it as 9 tenths. Now if I went over one more space, I would have gone over all 10 spaces out of 10, which is one whole, or 10 tenths. So in order to create a decimal number line, I want to use 10 spaces, which is what you'll see most of the time, or I can use 100 spaces, or I can use 1,000 spaces. It is not often that you will see a number line with 100 or 1,000 spaces. However, if I look at my number line from 0 to 1, we know that each of the tick marks in between count as tenths. But if I were to take a magnifying glass and hold it over this part of the number line, I'd find out there's actually 10 little tick marks between 0 and 1/10. So if I were to zoom in to this piece right here, I would find that between 0 and 1/10 there are 10 more spaces. So I'm going to create a second number line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then this is my 10th tick mark here. So this number line starts at 0 and goes to 1/10. So I could actually think about this as having 10 pennies, or 1 dime. And I know inside of 1 dime, that is where I have pennies. So inside of 0 to 1/10, I have my hundredths. So this is 1/100th. The next tick mark would be 2/100ths, and then 3/100ths, and so on and so forth. When I get to the tick mark right before the end, this would be 9/100ths. And I know that's representative of 9 pennies, and if I were to go one more space, that would be 10 pennies, or 10 hundredths. And I know 10 hundredths is equal to 1/10. So if I go back to looking at my number line from 0 to 1, pretend I wanted to label 55 hundredths on my number line. Well, I would start by looking at the tenths. So I know if I go over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces, this is labeled as 5 tenths. And I know if I were to go over the next space, this would be labeled as 6 tenths. So I know already I'm going to be between 5 and 6. Now I know that there are 10 little tick marks in between those spaces, and so I will look at my hundredths. And I know I cannot be exact, so I can kind of use estimation, but I know 5 pennies would put me halfway between 50 cents and 60 cents. So where my little green dot is would represent 55 hundredths. Now let's try an example with whole numbers. So nothing has changed. I've just started at 1 instead of 0. And I've made sure that I've left 10 spaces between my numbers. And I'm making sure that I'm counting the spaces, not the tick marks. So if I count between 1 and 2, I have 10 spaces. And between 2 and 3, there are also 10 spaces, which means that each of these tick marks is going to be worth 1/10. So let's start to plot some examples. I can start by looking at 1 and 3/10. So I know I'm going to start at 1, and the 10th place says I need to go over 3 out of 10 spaces. So starting at 1 whole, I'm going to go over 1/10, 2/10, 3/10. So I'm going to make my dot here and label it as 1 and 3/10. All right, the next example wants me to plot 1 and 75 hundredths. Before I look at my hundredths place, I'm going to start by looking at the tenths. So I know I'm going to go over 1 and 7/10. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This point is 1 and 7/10. And I know the next point would be 1 and 8/10. Now I'm going to look at my hundredths place. And just as we reviewed a second ago, there are 10 itty-bitty tick marks in between 1 and 7/10 and 1 and 8/10. And I'm going to use estimation again. I'm not going to be exact because the tick marks are so small. I know that 75 is exactly between 1 and 70 hundredths and 1 and 80 hundredths. So I am going to do the best I can to estimate and put my point halfway between the two tick marks, and that labels 1 and 75 hundredths. The next example uses the whole number 2. So I know automatically I'm going to start at 2, and the decimal says go over 6 out of 10 spaces, or 6/10. So I'm going to count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and this will correctly label 2 and 6/10. My second example also uses hundredths again, but I'm going to ignore that and focus on my tenths place first. So I'm starting at the whole number 2, and the tenths says go over 4 spaces. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So I know that this point is 2 and 4/10, and I know the next point is 2 and 5/10. And remember, I can put zeros behind it. So this also is 2 and 40 hundredths and 2 and 50 hundredths. And what is in between them is 10 little tick marks. And those tick marks would count up as 2 and 41 hundredths, 2 and 42 hundredths, 2 and 43 hundredths, and so on and so forth. Now, I know that 43 is not in the exact middle of 40 and 50 hundredths, so I'm going to use rounding to help me place my decimal this time. I know that 43 is closer to 40 than it is to 50. So when I plot this decimal, because it's in the hundredths, I can't be exact, but I know that I'm going to plot it a little bit closer to the 40 hundredths than the 50 hundredths. And it's important that when I'm labeling numbers on a decimal line that I always label the point so that if someone else were to look at my work, they would know that my exact point right here is 2 and 43 hundredths. Let's try a few more examples. This time my number line is numbered from whole number 7 to 8, and once again I have made sure that I have 10 spaces in between. So I know that each tick mark is worth 1/10. So if I look at this first example, This time I have numbers going out to the thousandths, but I'm going to ignore and start with my biggest place value. So I'm going to start at the whole number 7, and I'm definitely going to go over 2/10. So starting at 7, I know I'm going to go over 2 spaces. This tick mark is 7 and 2/10. Or I can look at it as 7 and 20 hundredths, or even if I wanted to look at it as the thousandths, that would be 7 and 200 thousandths. I know that my next tick mark would go over to 7 and 3/10, or 30 hundredths, or 300 thousandths. So I'm definitely going to be between these 2 tick marks because I know 7 and 2/10 is bigger than 2/10, but smaller than 3/10. Next, I'm going to look at the hundredths place. So if I were to think of this like money, you could think of it as I have $7.20 or I have $7.30. If I were to look at the number I'm trying to plot, the number I'm trying to plot is closer to being 7 and 20 cents rather than 7 and 30 cents. So the beauty of number lines is I can never be 100% exact, or I'd have to get really, really detailed with my drawings. So I know that when I go to plot this, I'm going to be a lot closer to the 7 and 20 hundredths than I am to 7 and 30 hundredths because of rounding. And I want someone to know what my exact point is, so I'm going to draw an arrow and write that this is 7 and 231 thousandths. If you notice, I didn't really even talk about the thousandths place because, once again, if I use rounding, this is pretty much like having $7.23. If I were to look at the number behind the 3, 1 would not round the number up. The next example, I'm going to start the same way. 7 and 67 hundredths. So I'm going to start at my whole number 7. And I know I need to go over 6/10. So I'm going to start by going over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I'm using these loops to help model the problem. If you want to draw them when you're working out a problem to help you, you can. If you don't need to draw out the loops, you don't have to. So I'm going to label this point. This is 7 and 6/10. I know the next point would be 7 and 7/10. So I know those are the 2 tick marks I'm going to fall between. And if you want to draw zeros behind it, I'm thinking of this as 60 and 70 hundredths. Once I've gone over my 6/10, now I can look at my hundredths place. So what I'm asking myself right now is 67 hundredths going to be closer to 60 or going to be closer to 70? And I know because of rounding, it should be a little bit closer to the 70. So I'm going to just kind of estimate and put my dot close to 70, not exactly halfway, a little bit more than halfway. And once again, I'm going to draw a line and label that this is 7 and 67 hundredths. If you notice, my next example, the whole number is the same, the tenths and the hundredths are the same. The only difference is they want me to go over 8 thousandths. 8 thousandths is even smaller than the tick marks that are already in there. So to label this number, once again, I'm going to use estimation, and I'm basically barely going over. I'm a little bit larger than 7 and 670 thousandths. And I can label this as 7 and 678 thousandths. All right, let's keep going. My next example starts at 7, and I'm going to go over 9/10. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is 7 and 9/10. And now I'm going to look at my hundredths place. So if this were $7.90, my next number is 8, like $8. And I know that 92 is going to be closer to 90 than it is $8. So I'm just going to go barely in front of 7 and 9/10 or 90 hundredths. and label this as 7 and 92 hundredths. My last two examples, I just stopped at the tenths, so I'm not going to have to use estimation at all. I know that if this is 7 and 9 tenths right here, this is going to be 7 and 8 tenths, and I can double check by counting over my spaces, 7, 8. And the last example is 7 and 4 tenths. So if I start at 7 and count over 4 places, I know that this point right here would be 7 and 4 tenths. So it's only when I start getting numbers in the hundredths and the thousandths that I use estimation and start going between the two tick marks on the line. So let's review. Every number line with decimals, I want to use the number of spaces that match a place value. Most often you will see 10 spaces, and that represents the place value of tenths. So in my first number line at the top, labeled from 0 to 1, because there are 10 spaces, I know that if I were numbering this number line, it would be 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, and so on and so forth. 7, 8, and then when I get to 9 tenths, the next one would be 10 tenths, which is the same as 1 whole. Now, I also know that between each of these tick marks, there are 10 more little ticks. So, on this next number line, if I were to zoom in between 0 and 1 tenth, I would be counting by hundredths. So this would be 1 hundredth, 2 hundredths, 3, 4, 5, and I know the money value would represent the same as pennies, 8 pennies. When I get to 9 pennies, or 9 hundredths, I know that the next value would put me at 10 hundredths, which is the same as having 10 pennies, or on place value terms, it would be like having a dime. Now, just like between 0 and 1 tenth, there were tick marks, I know that between 0 and 100th, there are actually 10 more little bitty tick marks that I can't see. So on this last number line, if I were to zoom in between 0 and 100th, this is where I would start numbering by thousandths. And you'll pretty much never see a number line divided into 1,000 spaces if I'm trying to be efficient with it. So because this one starts at 0 and goes to 100th, I know that in between here I'm counting by thousandths. So 1,000th, 2 thousandths, 3, 4, 5 thousandths, and eventually I will get to 9 thousandths, and the next number would be 10 thousandths. And that is the smallest that we're going to go on number lines, but I know that there could be 10 more tick marks in between those, which would be the next place value. Now try creating your own number line. I want you to label the following points on your number line: 4 tenths, 65 hundredths, 9 tenths, and 12 hundredths. Remember that I normally want to create a number line with 10 spaces to represent the tenths, and when I start getting numbers in the hundredths and the thousandths, I'm going to use estimation to help me decide where between tick marks I should label my point.